No towns, no buildings, no refuge for 100 miles in any direction. Out there on the open prairie, a blizzard meant one thing: find shelter or die where you stand. The temperature could plummet 40 degrees in less than an hour. Wind could reach 70 miles per hour, driving snow so hard it felt like needles against exposed skin. Visibility dropped to arm's length. One wrong decision, one moment of panic, one failure to read the warning signs, and a cowboy's bones would be found come spring thaw, frozen solid just yards from safety he never saw. They needed shelter that could be built in minutes with nothing but what they carried. They needed ways to stay warm without fire when the wind made flames impossible. They needed navigation methods that worked when landmarks disappeared behind walls of driving snow. The cowboys who lived through these prairie hellstorms knew the secrets. They knew how to read the sky like a book written in cloud and wind. They knew how to build life-saving shelter from snow itself. But how did cowboys survive blizzards that killed seasoned frontiersmen in a matter of hours? What were the shelter techniques that could keep a man alive for 3 days in whiteout conditions? How did they navigate when every direction looked identical and wrong choices led to frozen death? And what were the emergency warming methods that brought men back from the edge of freezing when their core temperature began to drop? Today, we're uncovering the proven survival strategies that kept cowboys alive during the most murderous storms in frontier history. The winter of 1886 to 1887 became known as the Great Die-Up across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Cattle froze, standing up. Entire herds vanished under 20-foot snowdrifts. Cowboys who had ridden the range for decades found themselves facing storms that turned familiar territory into a white maze of death. The difference between those who made it home and those who became prairie graves often came down to skills learned from Indians, mountain men, and hard experience on the unforgiving plains. These weren't just survival tricks. They were battle-tested methods that separated the living from the dead when nature unleashed her full fury. The sky reading came first because prevention saved more lives than any shelter technique ever could. Charlie Goodnight squints at the western horizon where a thin line of clouds hangs motionless above the prairie grass. The air feels different against his weathered face, heavy and still in a way that makes his horse nervous beneath him. The temperature has been dropping steadily for the past hour, and though the sun still shines overhead, Charlie knows what that line of clouds means. He has maybe 2 hours before the storm hits, maybe less. 40 years of riding the open range has taught him to read the prairie sky like scripture, and today the signs are spelling out death for any man caught unprepared. Cowboys developed an almost supernatural ability to predict deadly weather because their lives depended on recognizing danger before it arrived. The successful ones learned to read atmospheric conditions with an accuracy that rivaled any weather prediction available to city folks. They understood that the prairie sky communicated in a language of pressure, wind, and cloud formation that could spell the difference between a safe ride home and a frozen death. The pressure signs were the first indicators of approaching storms. Cowboys felt atmospheric pressure changes in their bones, quite literally. Old injuries ached when storms approached. Horses became skittish and restless hours before visible signs appeared. Cattle gathered together and faced away from the coming weather. Even experienced cowboys felt an unexplained uneasiness, a restless energy that warned of approaching danger. The cloud formations told specific stories about storm intensity and timing. A thin line of clouds on the horizon that remained stationary indicated a massive storm system approaching. These clouds appeared deceptively calm, but cowboys knew they marked the leading edge of potentially deadly weather. When these clouds began to build vertically, reaching high into the sky like giant towers, it meant the storm would be severe and long-lasting. The wind patterns provided crucial timing information. Before a major blizzard, the wind would often die completely, creating an eerie stillness that made horses nervous and gave experienced cowboys a feeling of dread. This calm period typically lasted 1 to 3 hours before the storm struck with full violence. Cowboys used this time to find or create shelter because once the wind began, visibility would drop to nothing, and movement became deadly. The temperature drops happened in predictable patterns. A sudden temperature drop of 10 to 15 degrees in an hour meant a serious storm was approaching. When the temperature continued dropping rapidly while the wind remained calm, cowboys knew they were facing a potential killer storm. The combination of dropping temperature and still air created conditions that would soon become a white hell of wind and snow. The animal behavior served as an early warning system that cowboys learned to read like a book. Cattle would cluster together and turn their backs to the approaching storm hours before it arrived. Horses would refuse to travel in certain directions, seeming to sense the approaching danger. Wild animals disappeared completely, seeking shelter in ways that told observant cowboys exactly where the storm would hit hardest. The light and air quality changes provided final warnings before storms struck. The air became thick and heavy, making breathing feel labored. The light took on a peculiar yellow or green tinge that experienced cowboys recognized as a sign of severe weather. The horizon would shimmer and dance in ways that indicated massive atmospheric disturbance approaching. Prairie storms moved with frightening speed across the flat landscape. Cowboys who understood the signs might have 2 hours warning. Those who didn't recognize the danger often had minutes to live once the storm arrived. The successful cowboys developed an instinct for reading these signs, checking the sky constantly during winter months and never traveling far from potential shelter when conditions looked questionable. The snow cave construction became essential knowledge for any cowboy who expected to see spring again. When Thomas Mackenzie feels the first snow pellets stinging his face like thrown sand, he immediately begins looking for a suitable drift or embankment. The wind is picking up speed, and he can hear it starting to howl across the empty prairie. His horse is already struggling against the gusts, and visibility is dropping fast. He has perhaps 20 minutes before this becomes a fight for his life. But Thomas knows the secret that has kept him alive through 15 prairie winters. Snow itself could become the shelter that would save him. The snow cave wasn't just a hole in a drift. It was an engineered shelter that could maintain interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than outside conditions. Cowboys learned to identify suitable snow formations that could be excavated quickly and safely. The ideal location was a deep drift on the lee side of a hill or embankment, where wind had deposited snow in a stable formation that wouldn't collapse during construction. The excavation technique required understanding of snow mechanics and structural integrity. Cowboys began by digging a small entrance hole at the base of the drift, then gradually excavating upward and outward to create a dome-shaped interior space. The entrance was kept lower than the main chamber so that warm air would be trapped inside while cold air flowed out through the opening. The interior design maximized heat retention and comfort. The sleeping area was carved as a raised platform above the entrance level, taking advantage of the fact that warm air rises and collects at the highest point of the shelter. The walls were smoothed to prevent dripping and collapse, and the ceiling was carved in a dome shape that distributed weight evenly and prevented cave-ins. Ventilation was critical for preventing carbon dioxide buildup and maintaining air quality. Cowboys created a small ventilation hole near the top of the dome, just large enough to allow air exchange, but small enough to prevent significant heat loss. This hole could be partially blocked with gear or clothing to regulate airflow based on interior conditions. The floor preparation involved creating a base that would insulate the occupant from ground cold. Cowboys laid down pine boughs, grass, or any available organic material to create a barrier between their bodies and the snow floor. Some carried small pieces of canvas or leather specifically for ground insulation during emergency situations. Snow caves relied solely on body heat for warmth generation, making it essential to manage personal warmth effectively. When traveling with partners, cowboys layered all their clothing, kept their extremities covered, and utilized shared body heat. The snow cave was capable of trapping and retaining body heat so well that its interior temperatures could rise to 20 or 30 degrees, even as the outside temperature fell below zero. The construction tools were limited to what cowboys carried. A knife, hatchet, or even bare hands could excavate an effective snow cave. Cowboys who regularly traveled winter ranges often carried a small shovel or entrenching tool specifically for emergency shelter construction. The key was working quickly and efficiently because exposure during construction could be as dangerous as remaining in the storm. Emergency modifications allowed cowboys to improve their shelters as conditions changed. Additional insulation could be added by packing more snow around the exterior walls. Interior space could be expanded if the storm lasted longer than expected. Multiple chambers could be connected if several people needed shelter together. The survival timeline in a properly constructed snow cave extended from hours to days. Cowboys could survive severe blizzards lasting 2 to 3 days if they had adequate clothing and understood proper body heat management. The shelter itself could last through multiple storms if properly maintained and not subjected to significant thaw and refreeze cycles. The body heat management techniques meant the difference between waking up alive or never waking up at all. Jack Morrison pulls his wool coat tighter around his chest as he settles into the snow cave he's just finished carving from a 10-foot drift. Outside, the blizzard is reaching full fury, with wind speeds that would knock a man down, and snow so thick he can't see his own outstretched hand. But inside this small dome of snow, wrapped in every piece of clothing he owns, and using techniques learned from a Lakota medicine man 3 winters ago, Jack knows he can survive until this killer storm passes. His life now depends on managing the heat his own body produces, because out here on the empty prairie, he is his own furnace. Cowboys developed sophisticated personal heating systems that maximized their body's natural heat production while minimizing heat loss to the environment. These techniques were learned from Indian tribes, mountain men, and through brutal trial and error on the winter ranges. The successful ones understood that the human body was remarkably efficient at producing heat, but only if that heat could be captured and retained effectively. The layering system was the foundation of cowboy winter survival. The base layer consisted of wool-long underwear that wickeded moisture away from the skin while maintaining insulation properties even when damp. Over this came wool shirts and pants that trapped air between fibers to create insulating dead air space. Typically, the outer layer consisted of leather chaps and a heavy coat made of wool or buffalo hide that protected against wind and rain. Each layer served a specific function in the heat retention system, and removing any layer could compromise the entire thermal management strategy. The extremity protection required special attention because fingers, toes, and ears were the first body parts to suffer frostbite damage. Cowboys wore multiple pairs of wool socks inside oversized boots that allowed air circulation while maintaining warmth. Hands were protected with wool gloves inside leather mittens, creating a dual-layer system that maintained dexterity while preventing heat loss. Hats were crucial for preventing heat loss through the head, and cowboys often wore wool caps under their regular hats during extreme cold. The breathing techniques helped warm incoming air and prevent lung damage from frigid temperatures. Cowboys learned to breathe through their nose rather than mouth, allowing nasal passages to warm and humidify incoming air. When necessary, they breathed through wool scarves or bandanas that pre-warmed air before it reached their lungs. Rapid breathing in extreme cold could cause lung damage, so controlled, steady breathing became a survival skill. The shared warming strategies were employed when cowboys traveled together or found themselves sheltering with partners. 2 men could share a single blanket or buffalo robe, combining their body heat to create a warm environment that either could maintain alone. The larger man typically positioned himself on the outside, using his greater heat production to warm both occupants. This technique could mean the difference between survival and death during multi-day storms. The movement and exercise protocols kept circulation active and prevented the lethargy that preceded hypothermia. Cowboys performed isometric exercises inside their shelters, tensing and relaxing muscle groups to generate heat and maintain circulation. Vigorous rubbing of hands and feet stimulated blood flow to extremities. These exercises had to be balanced against calorie conservation. as excessive movement could deplete energy reserves needed for heat production. The nutrition strategy focused on foods that generated internal heat through digestion. Cowboys carried high-fat foods like bacon, salt pork, and pemmican that required significant energy to digest, producing internal heat as a byproduct. Hot coffee or tea, when possible to prepare, provided both fluid replacement and immediate core warming. Some cowboys carried small amounts of whiskey specifically for emergency warming, understanding that alcohol could provide temporary heat sensation while also impairing judgment. The sleep management required techniques that prevented death during unconsciousness when body heat production naturally decreased. Using every blanket, coat, and covering at their disposal, cowboys fashioned insulation cocoons. They positioned themselves to take advantage of any available wind protection or residual ground heat. Some practiced controlled sleep patterns, waking every few hours to check circulation and perform warming exercises. The navigation when landmarks vanished could mean the difference between finding safety and wandering in circles until death claimed another victim. Samuel Rodriguez feels the panic starting to build in his chest as he stares into the wall of white that has swallowed the prairie in every direction. 20 minutes ago, he could see the line of cottonwoods that marked Willow Creek, his landmark for navigating back to the ranch. Now he can barely see his horse's ears through the driving snow. The wind is howling from what seems like every direction at once, and every step forward looks identical to every other step in this white wasteland. But Samuel has been riding these ranges for 8 years, and he knows the techniques that separate the living from the lost when the prairie becomes a maze of death. Cowboys developed navigation methods that worked when traditional landmarks became invisible, and compasses were useless in the magnetic anomalies of some prairie regions. These techniques relied on understanding wind patterns, terrain features, and natural navigation methods that remained constant even during severe storms. The successful ones could find their way to safety when lesser cowboys wandered in circles until exhaustion and cold claimed their lives. The wind reading was the most reliable navigation tool during blizzards because wind direction remained relatively consistent throughout most storm systems. Cowboys learned to identify the prevailing wind direction before storms hit, then used this knowledge to maintain directional awareness even when visibility dropped to zero. By keeping the wind hitting their left shoulder, for example, they could maintain an eastward heading even when they couldn't see 5 feet ahead. This technique required understanding that wind direction could shift during long storms, but major changes usually happened gradually enough for experienced men to adjust their navigation accordingly. The terrain memorization became crucial when visual landmarks disappeared behind curtains of snow. Cowboys spent years learning every hill, depression, creek bed, and slope in their territory. During blizzards, they could feel changes in terrain through their horse's movement and use these subtle elevation changes to maintain directional awareness. A slight upward slope might indicate movement toward a particular ridge. A downward trend could signal approach to a creek bed that led toward ranch buildings. This intimate knowledge of land features allowed navigation by feel when sight became useless. The horse behavior provided additional navigation assistance because horses often demonstrated better directional sense than their riders during storms. Cowboys with experience came to rely on their horses' instincts when it appeared the animal knew the route home. Horses could smell water, shelter, and other horses from distances that amazed their human partners. Some cowboys would give their horses limited control during storms, allowing the animal to choose direction while maintaining overall guidance toward known safe areas. During long storms, cowboys used the emergency marking systems to prevent themselves from moving in circles. Using ropes, bandanas, or pieces of equipment, they could mark their path and avoid retracing the same ground repeatedly. Some cowboys carried small amounts of flour or other materials that could be dropped as trail markers, though this technique required careful rationing to ensure supplies lasted through the emergency. The shelter recognition became vital for identifying potential refuge that might be invisible until the last moment. Cowboys learned to recognize the subtle signs of structures, natural windbreaks, or terrain features that could provide life-saving protection. A slight discoloration in the snow might indicate a building. A change in wind pattern could signal a grove of trees or rock formation. These skills required years of experience and careful observation to develop. The timing and speed management prevented exhaustion while maintaining progress toward safety. Cowboys learned to pace themselves during storm travel, balancing the need for speed against the danger of becoming exhausted and unable to continue. Rapid movement generated heat but depleted energy reserves. Slow movement conserved energy but increased exposure time. Finding the optimal pace required understanding personal limits and storm conditions. The emergency fire-making could provide warmth and navigation signals when conditions allowed flame to survive the wind. Charlie Henderson crouches behind his horse, using the animal's body to block the worst of the driving wind as he strikes flint against steel for the fourth time. The tiny sparks land on the char cloth hidden inside his vest, and for a moment, a small glow appears in the darkness of the storm. His fingers are so cold they barely respond to his commands, but Charlie knows this fire could save his life if he can nurse it into flame. Around him, the blizzard rages with a fury that seems determined to kill everything in its path. But Charlie has learned the secrets of making fire in conditions that would defeat most men. His survival depends on coaxing flame from the smallest spark when the wind wants to extinguish every attempt at warmth. Cowboys developed fire-making techniques specifically adapted to extreme weather conditions because fire could provide warmth, cooking capability, and signaling during emergencies. These methods required special preparation, specific materials, and techniques that could succeed when normal fire starting failed completely. The successful cowboys understood that fire in blizzard conditions was more science than art, requiring precise execution of proven methods. The tinder preparation began long before winter storms threatened. Cowboys transported fire-starting materials that had been specially prepared to ignite under cold and wet conditions. Char cloth was fabric that had been partially burned to create material that would catch the smallest spark instantly. This tinder was stored in waterproof containers made from animal gut or waxed leather to keep it dry during travel. Some cowboys prepared pine pitch mixed with shredded bark that would burn even when damp, creating reliable ignition material for emergency situations. The kindling collection required identifying materials that would burn quickly and hot enough to ignite larger fuel sources. Fast-burning kindling made from dry grass twisted into bundles could ignite from char cloth and burn fiercely enough to catch small twigs on fire. Dead branches from the underside of pine trees remained dry even during storms and provided excellent kindling material. Cowboys learned to recognize these resources quickly, even during limited visibility conditions. The fuel gathering focused on materials that would burn long and hot enough to provide meaningful warmth. Buffalo chips, when dry, burned with intense heat and were often available even in winter conditions. Dead wood from creek bottoms and grove areas provided longer-burning fuel. Some cowboys carried small amounts of coal or specially prepared fuel specifically for emergency fire situations. The wind protection was essential for maintaining flame during storm conditions. Cowboys used their horse's body, natural terrain features, or hastily built windbreaks to create calm areas where fire could survive. Some built small fire pits below ground level or surrounded by stones to protect flames from wind. The key was creating a microenvironment where combustion could occur despite hostile external conditions. The ignition techniques had to work with numb fingers and limited dexterity in extreme cold. Cowboys practiced fire-starting methods until they could execute them by feel alone, because storm conditions often made precise movements impossible. Flint and steel remained the most reliable ignition method, but it required dry tinder and proper technique to generate adequate sparks in cold conditions. The fire management required constant attention to maintain flame during high winds and heavy snow. Cowboys fed fires continuously with small amounts of fuel rather than large additions that could be blown out by wind gusts. They built fires in progressive stages, starting with the smallest possible flame and gradually building to larger fires that could withstand storm conditions. The fire placement considered both immediate warming needs and longer-term survival requirements. Cowboys positioned fires to provide maximum heat reflection while minimizing exposure to wind and precipitation. Some built fires against rock faces or in natural depressions that would reflect and concentrate heat. The key was balancing heat production with fuel conservation and safety considerations. The emergency signaling used fire and smoke to attract rescue when possible. Cowboys created signal fires that could be seen from great distances when visibility improved. Smoke signals could communicate distress to other cowboys or ranch personnel who might be searching for missing men. These signals had to be visible above storm conditions while conserving precious fuel resources. The alternative warming methods provided life-saving heat when fire was impossible or insufficient. When Robert Dalton realizes his small fire is losing the battle against the wind and his fuel supply is nearly exhausted, he knows he must rely on the warming techniques that have kept cowboys alive when flames failed them. His horse stands shivering beside him, and both man and animal are losing the fight against the killing cold. But Robert has learned methods from Cheyenne warriors and mountain men that can generate warmth without fire, techniques that can keep a man's blood flowing when everything else has failed. His survival now depends on using his own body heat, his horse's warmth, and every piece of equipment he carries to create enough heat to last until the storm passes. Cowboys developed alternative warming strategies for situations when fire was impossible or inadequate for survival needs. These techniques relied on maximizing body heat production, trapping existing warmth, and using available resources to create heating systems that didn't require combustion. The methods were proven through desperate necessity and could mean the difference between life and death when traditional heating failed. The horse warming utilized the animal's body heat as a survival resource. Horses generated significantly more body heat than humans and could serve as living furnaces during extreme emergencies. Cowboys positioned themselves against their horse's belly or flanks to absorb radiant heat from the animal's body. During the harshest conditions, some cowboys would crawl partially under their horse's belly, using the animal as a source of warmth and a shield from the wind. This technique required a calm, well-trained horse and careful positioning to avoid injury. The equipment heating involved using metal objects as heat storage and transfer devices. Cowboys heated spurs, belt buckles, knives, and other metal gear in small fires or through friction, then placed these heated objects inside their clothing to provide localized warming. Metal conducted and retained heat effectively, and heated metal objects could provide warmth for 30 to 60 minutes before requiring reheating. This technique allowed cowboys to maintain core body temperature using minimal fuel resources. The friction heating generated warmth through vigorous physical activity designed to increase circulation and heat production. Cowboys performed specific exercises that could be conducted in confined spaces while conserving energy. Rapid arm swinging, leg movements, and isometric muscle contractions generated internal heat while improving circulation to extremities. These exercises had to be balanced against energy conservation, as excessive movement could deplete caloric reserves needed for sustained heat production. The insulation layering maximized the effectiveness of existing clothing and equipment. Cowboys used saddle blankets, spare clothing, and even paper or cloth stuffing to create additional insulation layers. Every piece of fabric or material could be incorporated into a comprehensive insulation system. Some cowboys carried spare socks or small blankets for the specific purpose of emergency insulation. The body position management reduced heat loss through strategic positioning and movement. Cowboys learned to minimize exposed surface area by curling into compact positions that reduced heat loss through radiation. They avoided contact with cold surfaces that would draw heat away from their bodies through conduction. Proper positioning inside shelters could reduce heat loss by 20 to 30% compared to poor positioning. The breathing warming helped prevent lung damage while providing internal heat. Cowboys breathed into their clothing or cupped hands to warm air before it reached their lungs. This technique also created pockets of warm air inside clothing that provided additional insulation. Controlled breathing exercises could generate internal heat while conserving energy for other survival activities. The emergency protocols that saved lives when every system failed required cowboys to make life-or-death decisions with frozen minds and failing bodies. When Henry Stockton feels the dangerous drowsiness beginning to cloud his thinking, he knows he's entering the final stages of his battle against the cold. His snow cave has kept him alive for 18 hours, but his body temperature is dropping despite his best efforts, and he can feel the lethargy that comes before a man freezes to death. The storm outside shows no sign of weakening, and Henry realizes he may not live to see another dawn. But Henry knows the emergency techniques that have brought men back from the edge of frozen death, methods so extreme they were used only when all other options had failed. Cowboys developed final resort survival techniques for situations when standard methods proved insufficient and death seemed imminent. These emergency protocols were based on understanding the progression of hypothermia and the critical interventions that could reverse potentially fatal heat loss. The techniques were desperate measures used only when survival hung by the thinnest thread. The recognition of hypothermia stages allowed cowboys to understand when they were approaching critical danger levels. The first stage involved uncontrollable shivering and difficulty with fine motor control. Cowboys who recognized these signs knew they needed to take immediate action to increase heat production and retention. The second stage brought confusion, slurred speech, and loss of coordination. Men in this stage required emergency intervention to prevent progression to fatal hypothermia. The final stage involved cessation of shivering, loss of consciousness, and apparent death. Cowboys learned that men in this stage could sometimes be revived with proper rewarming techniques. The emergency rewarming focused on gradually raising core body temperature without causing dangerous shock to the system. Cowboys used shared body heat, placing hypothermic individuals in direct skin contact with warmer partners. This technique required careful temperature management to prevent rapid rewarming that could cause cardiac problems. The process was gradual and controlled, focusing on warming the core before attempting to warm extremities. The critical decision-making involved choices between dangerous alternatives when all options carried significant risk. Cowboys facing imminent death from exposure might choose to risk travel in zero visibility rather than remain in inadequate shelter. These decisions required weighing the probability of finding better shelter against the certainty of death from continued exposure. Experienced cowboys developed judgment for making these crucial choices under extreme stress. The equipment sacrifice involved burning or destroying valuable possessions when fuel was needed for survival fires. Cowboys would burn saddles, leather goods, clothing, and even money when these materials could provide life-saving heat. The calculation was simple. Property could be replaced, but a frozen cowboy could not. This willingness to sacrifice valuable equipment often separated survivors from those who died trying to preserve their possessions. The emergency signaling attempts used any available method to attract rescue when self-rescue became impossible. Cowboys created noise with metal objects, fired guns into the air when ammunition was available, or used any reflective surface to signal during brief clear periods. These signals had to be repeated regularly because rescue parties might pass within a few hundred yards without detecting distressed cowboys in storm conditions. The survival partnerships involved cooperation strategies when multiple cowboys were caught together in deadly storms. Partners shared body heat, took turns maintaining fires or shelter, and supported each other through the psychological challenges of extended exposure. The buddy system increased survival chances significantly, but it also required careful resource management and decision-making to prevent one person's poor choices from killing both partners. The final preparations involved making peace with possible death while continuing to fight for survival. Cowboys understood that death from exposure was a real possibility during severe storms, and this acceptance allowed them to make clear-headed decisions without panic. At the same time, they continued survival efforts until the last possible moment, understanding that rescue could arrive unexpectedly or storm conditions could change rapidly. These survival techniques weren't just about enduring cold weather. They were about understanding the deadly mathematics of exposure, where every decision affected the probability of seeing another sunrise. Cowboys who mastered these methods understood that winter on the open prairie was a test of knowledge, preparation, and will to survive. The techniques they developed through necessity and desperation became the foundation for survival strategies that kept men alive in conditions that would kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. Today, these same principles remain the difference between life and death when modern men find themselves facing the raw power of nature's winter fury. The cowboys who survived the Great Die-Up and countless other prairie storms understood a truth that every frontiersman learned or died ignorant of. In the wilderness, knowledge is life, preparation is survival, and the man who understands the secrets of staying warm when the world turns cold is the man who lives to ride another day.